Hello, everyone. This week we're going to be talking about some strengths and weaknesses of different research methods that are commonly used in psychology. The information we're going to cover this week is probably similar to what you learned about in your research methods class, but we're going to concentrate more on the strengths and limitations of each kind of study rather than how to conduct them. And also in research methods, you probably talk about the different methods over half of the semester. Well, in this week, we're going to discuss all of the different methods together, which should make drawing comparisons between them easier. In this PowerPoint, we're going to focus on case studies, field studies, survey research, and meta-analyses. So let's begin by talking about case studies. Case studies are a detailed description of a single, often unique individual or a small number of individuals. Case studies are basically like anecdotes. The purpose of a case study is to go into great detail about the performance of a single, usually exceptional individual, or a small number of individuals who have something in common. Some examples of case studies in psychology would be case studies on people with a particular kind of brain damage, or those with a particular extraordinary ability. One good example of this is a man named Rajan, who is very famous for his feats of memory. A good example is that at one point he held the world record for remembering the digits of pi. Specifically, he was able to recall the first 31,811 digits of pi at the rate of 3.5 digits per second. The main strength of case studies is that they are good for gathering information for generating hypotheses about a topic when little is known about that topic. For example, a person might suffer brain damage to a part of their brain, and then they might have trouble with a certain kind of task. Case studies would go into detail about the exact location of this damage, the types of tasks the person can do, and then the types of tasks that the person cannot do. This information would help us to generate hypotheses about what this part of the brain might be used for. Another good example of a case study in psychology was Piaget's case study of his own children. At the time he began his research, not much was known about the decision-making ability of children, and Piaget hypothesized that children's thinking had a unique structure of its own. To test his theory, he closely examined how his children worked out problems and developed his theories based largely on their behavior. Now, some of Piaget's ideas on how children think have been confirmed by other studies, while others haven't. The point is about the usefulness of Piaget's case studies. They were useful for psychology because not much was known about children's thinking at the time, and so Piaget's anecdotes were helpful. The main weakness of case studies is that because they are based on a small number of subjects, the generalizability of the results is questionable. So say, for example, that when Piaget's children were younger than 6, they didn't show quantity conservation. To test for this thinking ability, a child would be presented with 2 identical beakers containing the same amount of liquid, and the child would say that, yep, the beakers do contain the same amount of liquid, that A and B contain the same amount of water. When one of the beakers is poured into a taller, thinner container, however, children who are typically younger than 7 or 8 years old say that the 2 beakers, A and C, now contain a different amount of liquid. The child simply focuses on the height and width of the container and concludes that the volume must be different. Now, that's interesting that Piaget's children can't do this, but what does this tell us about the thinking ability of children in general? Nothing definitive, right? It's interesting, but this difficulty with quantity conservation may be unique to Piaget's children. So again, the weakness, because case studies are based on a small number of subjects, the generalizability of the results is questionable. Okay, next we have field studies. Field studies are methods of conducting research in the environment where the behaviors naturally occur versus in a laboratory. Field studies are about doing a study in the natural environment rather than bringing people into a lab. For example, in one study, the researcher trained college students to approach opposite-sex bar patrons and to deliver one of several different kinds of lines, and then they measured the positivity of each person's response to the lines. They found that women preferred simple lines like "hi" to flippantly delivered lines like "you remind me of someone I used to date" or "I bet I can outdrink you." Men didn't care what kind of lines were delivered. They responded equally positively to all 3. So we need this kind of research to show us that women don't like being compared to a man's ex-girlfriend, and men just like talking with women. But anyway, the key point is that this study was actually conducted in a bar versus in a lab. let's talk about different types of field studies. One kind of field study is a field experiment, where an experiment is conducted in the natural environment rather than in a lab. In one study like this, the researchers tested the broken window explanation for a crime, that incidental indicators of social disorder, like broken windows and graffiti, can actually increase crime rates by sending signals that transgressions are the norm in that area. They tested this theory by putting a paper flyer on bicycles in one of two alleys: a clean alley with a sign prohibiting graffiti, and an alley with lots of graffiti on the walls. What they found was that people were more than twice as likely to litter, that is, to throw the flyer on their bike on the ground, in the graffiti-covered alley versus the clean alley. Another type of field study is naturalistic observations, which involves observing and recording behaviors as they occur in their natural setting. Notice that naturalistic observations are just about observing, not manipulating like we would do for a field experiment. Naturalistic observations might be used to answer questions like, how does a special education student fare in a regular classroom? Probably the most famous naturalistic observation study in psychology was Jane Goodall's study of chimpanzees, where she went to their natural habitat and observed the chimpanzees there. In another study, the researchers wanted to know whether men at bars gave off nonverbal cues that women picked up on, and whether certain nonverbal behaviors produced more success than others. They observed 38 men in 3 Pennsylvania bars for 30 minutes, looking for 4 categories of behaviors: physical space changes, glancing behaviors, gesturing, and touching. As you can see, there were some differences between successful and unsuccessful men. Specifically, successful men made more glancing and space-maximizing behaviors and fewer closed body movements. The key point is that it's unlikely that men and women would behave in the same way in a laboratory as they would in a bar. So this is the kind of study that you would want to conduct as a field study. And then the last kind of field study I'll mention is participant observation studies, where the researcher becomes a member of the group he or she is observing. So for instance, if a researcher is interested in what goes on in AA meetings, he or she would join AA, often anonymously, so the group doesn't know that they are being observed by a researcher. I've also read about these kinds of studies where researchers secretly joined an Amish community or a cult to learn more about them. The main strength of field studies is that they are high in external validity, that the results may be more likely to generalize to real-world situations. So this is probably the main reason to conduct field studies. Think back to the male nonverbal behavior gestures at a bar example, right? No matter how realistic you make the laboratory setting, you could probably never simulate the experience of a bar on a Friday night, and so a field study is preferable. So yeah, to find out how people behave at a bar, it's probably best to just observe their behavior in a real bar. Some of the main weaknesses of field studies, though, is that researchers have little to no control over this study, and there might be some ethical issues with them. Going back to the bar example, it might be, for instance, that it's ladies' night at one bar, and so it may be easier for a man to be successful on that night. Or some men who were observed may have made arrangements to meet with a particular woman, so it seems like the woman going over to the man is spontaneous and based on the man's behaviors when it isn't. And like I said, people may also change their behavior if they know they're being observed, but not telling people that you're observing them may lead to ethical questions, so there are ethical issues with field studies as well. All right, next, let's talk about survey research, which is about asking questions to lots of subjects, for example, using questionnaires or polls that I'm sure everybody has completed many times in their lives. Survey research is basically the opposite of case study research. Surveys allow you to examine the views of a variety of people, of lots of different people, rather than just a few, and thus to say something meaningful about the whole population, again, rather than a couple individuals. The main strength of survey research is that it's good at making relative comparisons between options, groups, time periods, etc., not at determining exact percentages in the population. So as we'll talk about over the next couple of slides, given all of the weaknesses with survey research, it is essentially impossible to come up with the exact percent of people in the population who believe or do something using this type of research. That is, survey research is actually quite poor for determining the exact percent of people in America who will vote for a candidate. or the exact percent of people who agree with the statement. Let's use this graph as an example, which is survey data based on the question, do you favor or oppose stricter gun control laws? Even though what stands out is the percent of people who favor versus oppose stricter gun laws, due to all the weaknesses with survey research I'll discuss in a minute, this is actually a poor use of survey research. Instead, a better use of survey research is to make relative comparisons between these options. That is, to conclude that more Americans favor stricter gun control than oppose it. So yes, let's talk about some of the weaknesses with survey research. The thing to keep in mind about survey research is that the data are only as good as the people we ask, the questions we ask, and the answers we receive. So one weakness is that a sample that is too small, that is not representative of the population, or that has a large non-response rate will limit the validity of the findings. We talked about the issue of small sample size when we discussed case studies. So in general, larger sample sizes will create more accurate estimates than smaller sample sizes. In terms of representativeness, a representative sample is one where people in the sample have the same proportion of characteristics as people in the population, in terms of things like sex, race, age, socioeconomic status, religious affiliation, characteristics like that. So keep in mind that if a sample is 90% female, but the population we're trying to say something about is only 50% female, the sample won't be representative, and so the results won't be valid. And finally, a low response rate lowers the survey's representativeness. The problem is that those who can't be reached, or those who refuse to participate, may differ in unknown ways from those who are willing to participate, lowering the survey's validity. Another weakness with survey research is that the accuracy of surveys and polls is often lowered by the following. So remember, the goal of the survey is to get an accurate impression of how people really feel about a topic. These are going to be some factors then that can bias people to respond in a certain way, and not how they actually feel about a topic or what they will likely do in the future. And so if these factors are present, the results won't be valid. One factor that can lower the accuracy of surveys is participants' faulty memories or dishonesty. It may be that people genuinely make a memory error, or that they intentionally lie, presumably to make themselves look better. As an example, in one study, people were asked how many cans of beer were consumed in their household each week. Here were the survey responses. Well, the researchers didn't believe these numbers, so what they did was to go back to the people's houses 1 week later and count the number of beer cans in people's trash. Here are the actual numbers of beer cans than in people's garbage. As we can see, a lot more cans were found than were reported, indicating that people are either really bad at remembering how much beer they drink each week, or that they were intentionally lying on the survey to make themselves look better. Another factor that can lower the accuracy of surveys is the questions being worded in a confusing or biased way. For instance, consider this question. Given the importance to future generations of preserving the environment, do you believe that the Clean Air Act should be strengthened, weakened, or left alone? Well, that question kind of biases people to respond in a certain way, even if that's not how they truly feel. As one more example, to better compete against McDonald's, Burger King ran an ad campaign where they claimed that 75% of people surveyed preferred Whoppers over Big Macs. The question that they asked was, do you prefer your hamburgers flame grilled or fried? Well, which one sounds better to you guys, flame grilling a hamburger or frying it? So yeah, the problem is that flame grilled, how Burger King does it, just sounds so much better than frying it, how McDonald's does it. This question was then phrased in a less value-laden way. Do you prefer a hamburger that is grilled on a hot stainless steel grill, which is frying it, or cooking it by passing the raw meat through an open gas flame, which is flame grilling it? Now, more than half of the people preferred McDonald's way. Another factor is when previous questions influence participants' responses on future questions. An example is asking a negative question about a candidate in the survey before asking someone whether they would vote for him or her. The point is that you want a person to respond on the survey based how they truly feel and actually plan to vote in the election, not how they're being influenced to respond while taking the survey. So doing so would lower the accuracy of your survey. One final factor is a lack of disclosure regarding how the questions were worded or how the sample was collected. So in the news, you often only hear the results of surveys, not necessarily the exact questions participants were asked, or how the sample was collected, or how many people participated, things like that. So you might hear, for example, that 77% of people in the survey favored more gun control, but you might not know the actual question that was asked on the survey. Was it truly that broad? Do you favor more gun control or not? Or did they ask about a specific policy, such as universal background checks or banning the sale of certain types of guns? So again, in order to be able to properly interpret the results of a survey, you need to know exactly which question was asked. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about regarding surveys is the margin of error. So you might see that the margin of error on a poll was like plus or minus 3, but I don't know if a lot of people know what that actually means. So the margin of error means that if the survey were conducted on the population in the same way it was on the sample, there is a 95% chance that the results would be within the margin of error. This is kind of confusing, so let's go straight into an example. Let's say we ask a sample of Maryland residents whether they plan to vote for the Democrat or the Republican candidate for governor in the next election. And let's say that in our sample of those people we surveyed, 41% said that they plan to vote for the Democrat, and 44% say they plan to vote for the Republican, with the rest being undecided and the margin of error being 4%. What this means then is if we asked everybody in the state of Maryland, so everybody in the population, this exact same question, we could be 95% confident that 37 to 45% of people would say they'd vote for the Democrat, and 40 to 48% of people would say they'd vote for the Republican candidate. Note then that the margin of error does not mean how votes will turn out in the actual election, how many people are undecided, or the chance that the poll is wrong, but rather how we'd expect the results to turn out if we asked everyone in the population that question. The last type of study I want to talk about today is the meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a method of determining the average effect size of a variable by combining the results of many studies conducted on that topic. So let's say we're interested in whether Prozac is more effective than a placebo at lowering depression scores. Obviously, hundreds of studies have looked at this question where they determined the depression scores of people who were given Prozac, the depression scores of people who were given a placebo, and then they compared and found the difference between the two groups in terms of their depression scores. And let's say these are the results for 7 studies on this topic. So studies A through D find an advantage for Prozac versus placebo. So people who are given Prozac have lower depression scores than those given a placebo. Studies E and F find an advantage for the placebo, and study G finds no difference between groups given Prozac and a group given a placebo. What a meta-analysis does then is to essentially combine these effect sizes or differences to find the average effect size. The main strength of a meta-analysis is that the average effect size is likely more accurate than the effect size from any one particular study. That is, given that we're trying to find the answer to the question, what is the true difference in depression scores between people given Prozac versus a placebo, you're hopefully going to get a more accurate measure if you combine the results of lots of different studies than if you pick one at random and conclude, well, that study has the actual true difference. Right? No study is perfect, but when you average across a large number of studies, you're going to get a result that's closer to the true effect size. And then the main weakness of meta-analyses is that they rely on the authority of the researcher to select appropriate studies, and the results can be affected by selection bias of included studies. Authors usually come up with certain criteria for picking studies, maybe based on the journal that the article was published in, or the minimum number of people in each group, and the method by which the statistics are reported in the original articles. However, it's possible that the authors writing the meta-analysis intentionally or unintentionally leave out studies or come up with criteria that exclude the studies that they don't want to include in their analysis. Similarly, it's important that the authors are experts in the field so that they can determine which studies were conducted well and thus should be included, and which studies were conducted poorly and thus should be excluded, but this may or may not be the case. Anyway, that's all I have for you for our first set of research methods. Don't forget to look at the other PowerPoint to see the other groups of methods.